The idea of a variable font is to take the whole range of that design space and combine it in a single file, which then allows it to act like many. Teaching designers to think about all of those ways to vary stuff in their interface animations, in headings and display sizes and captions. And I think we're really at the very beginning of what can be done. I think motion is a place where they'll really excel.
What is up, typography enthusiasts? I'm Oliver Schöndorfer, user interface designer and typographer, welcoming you to another talk at Pimp My Type. Variable fonts are nothing new anymore. Since Google is pushing them hard since a few years and all the major design tools adopted them, they kind of become the new standard. And there are a lot of benefits when it comes to file size, possible benefits, but they really don't excite me that much. It's the creative possibilities they bring that are interesting to me, but nevertheless I don't see them used very often in an interesting way. And this is why I invited Jason Pamental today as my guest to share his immense knowledge about the topic of variable fonts. I see him as someone who is working at the intersection of technology and design. Because technology and aesthetics always go hand in hand. You can't design something interesting or good without knowing what's possible. So you need this to unlock creative potential. It was a great conversation. We cover what's the difference with typography for screen design, but also what effects bad typography has on people.
It slows people down. It makes it harder for them to trust a website or to get the information they need to make a purchasing decision.
We also nerd out a lot about performance and loading fonts. Jason also shares very practical tips that you can apply to make your site faster and look better.
The mileage that you get out of loading a font resource impacts the display of every word on every page.
And at the end of our talk, we even touch on the future with progressive font loading, which will bring a lot of benefits, especially to non-Latin scripts. So the future's right ahead. All that closing with a brilliant answer to my very, very mean question: Papyrus or Comic Sans? Yeah, stay for that. Note that there are chapter marks so you can jump to the timestamps that interest you the most. This is how I appreciate your valuable attention. Of course, you're welcome, you're welcome. Find all the mentioned fonts, resources and links under pimpmytype.com/talk03, where you can also subscribe to my weekly Font Friday newsletter to get a nice update each week for a nice typeface. But now let's enjoy variable font design possibilities and performance with Jason Pamental. I'm very excited and honored to have you as a guest, Jason Pamental. And for introducing Jason, he's a principal designer at Chewy.com, tinkerer and typographer, as he describes himself. And for a more, let's say, personal relationship I have with him, it's the first time we meet in person here virtually, Jason, but I know you since years from Twitter and also from your newsletter, your typography newsletter you sent over. And my first touch point with you was, I think, back in 2018 when I started with variable fonts and wrapping my head around this topic, and you were one of the first persons talking about this and how to implement it and also the typographic advantages that come with it. So welcome to Pimp My Type, Jason.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. It's really great to be here. And you know, from my perspective, I remember first hearing your name when I'm trying to remember what event it was where you were giving a talk on variable fonts. And I was just so excited because I think you were like one of, you know, maybe only 3 or 4 other people talking about variable fonts at events. I don't remember if it was Beyond Tellerrand or some other event, probably in that time frame around 2018 or so. But Mandy Michael was talking about stuff at conferences, and I was, and really almost nobody else. And so your name really jumped out, and so then I don't know when we like sort of connected over Twitter after that, but it's just been nice to see it start to spread, and I'm excited to be on your show and be more a part of what you're doing to spread the word about good typography. So I'm excited. Thank you.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. Yeah, I guess it was Beyond Tellerrand back then in Berlin in October 2018, where I also had the pleasure to meet David Jonathan Ross in person, who might be, I think, geographically, not just typographically, because you're using his typeface on your website, close to your location in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, it is. Yes, it's not not too quick a drive. It's about 2.5, 3 hours away. But
Okay.
It's not a plane ride.
Yeah.
Geographically, it's a couple hundred miles. So I've been out to his house for a little type weekend get together that he had a couple of years ago, and he and I have been friends really since the introduction of variable fonts. When I met him for the first time,
Yeah.
I think in Warsaw at A-Type I,
Oh, really?
when variable fonts were introduced.
Oh, that's awesome. Basically, you're so close, and then you have to meet up in Poland.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, but that's what these events are for. So, yeah, to get this thing started, I would love to ask you my first question, which is always my first question. What's your favorite typographic mistake, Jason?
I have not really given this a ton of thought, but I'm going to come back to my favorite mistake being not loading the fonts right in the first place.
Oh, that's a good
Because
one.
it is like the oldest problem in using web fonts. And it's one that has been solvable since 2010. And still it is like whenever I show it in a talk, um, it seems like it's brand new to people. So I'm not being very effective in the word about this apparently, but using a web font loader, and using the class that it adds to the page to add CSS to style the fallback fonts. So that's the thing that I see go wrong most frequently, and it drives me up a wall because it's definitely a very solvable problem. But I see it all the time when you want your content on the screen, but this happens actually in the New York Times website and on their apps, which kills me that it happens in their
Oh
apps.
no.
When the fallback font loads, while the web font is loading, the metrics of the text is often quite different. So you get headlines wrapping differently and navigation moving around and stuff. And then all of a sudden the web font loads and it, snaps back into place. And that was the original thing that people hated about web fonts, and they called it FOUT, or flash of unstyled text.
Mm-hmm.
And then it moved to invisible text because Safari started hiding the text until the web font loaded, without any timeout initially. And then all the browsers kind of standardized on 3 seconds, but still, if you look at everybody loves to quote this research from Google about, if you don't have your content on screen in less than 3 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever it was, you've lost half your audience. And if the browser isn't showing any content for 3 seconds waiting for a web font to load, that's a pretty big gamble. So people switch over to using font display swaps so that it goes directly to the fallback font. But if they haven't styled the fallback font, then they get that same problem. So favorite is maybe not the best word, but it's
Most
certainly the one.
despised.
I think I have some opinions about this. And it's just one of those things that it is that intersection of that art and technology, of typography, user experience, and the technology of implementing them that I think is like, that defines what I think is so interesting about web typography as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, flash of unstyled text. I had this. I'm always a fan of seeing at least some text on the page, even if it's not set properly, as you said before, but they should then add the loading classes or something. And I'll add to this, when I was a guest on several podcasts, web design podcasts, and I gave them a quick review of their site. In 2 cases, they did not load the web fonts at all. So which then was, okay, it was the fallback font all the way long, and the problem there was they didn't see it because they had it locally installed, and I didn't see it. So yeah, that's a hard one. So loading your web fonts at all and properly, this might be the basic step to have a decent web typography. Yeah, sure. All right.
Yes, they've got to show up in the first place before you can do anything interesting with them.
Yeah, definitely. So when we come, what fascinates you a lot is basically the concept of web typography. You wrote a book about that back then, about responsive web typography, which might be a bit dated for now, but the principles of typography don't change over time, or didn't change a lot over time, so since the last 500 years or so. But what would you say, what benefits does it bring to learn about typography for developers, designers, for anybody? Why do you think is this such an important topic?
Because for most of us who work on the web, the bulk of what we're dealing with is putting text on screen. And so with that, if you don't put the text up in a clear, readable, engaging, accessible way, then you're missing out. Your reader is missing out. The visitor to your website isn't getting what you want them to get out of it. And so there's so many things about the implementation of that, where you can see, like, if you've studied typography at all, you look at the modern web and you see these challenges that crop up all over the place, because it's not routine for developers or UX designers, for that matter, to take a course in typography. So you see tons of centered text everywhere, which is harder to read for people when it's, more than a line or two. You see really long lines of text that are really hard to follow as they get across. You see text set in too light a color on a light background, or too small for people to be able to read well, or not resizable. So like there's all of these nuances about how reading works. And that's really, that's a big part of this is, how do we see letters and words and phrases? How does our vision work? How does it age? What's the difference in setting type for a young person versus someone my age? What are the things that are going to be different about that? And how can we accommodate that? And I think that's like a really interesting area to me, is that you've got the classical principles of typography, which were considered in a somewhat immutable way, meaning you're applying these rules to this piece of design that you're working on, or this typesetting at this size on this piece of paper with this ink, with this typeface. And that is all somewhat fixed. And we don't even know what the paper size is going to be, for us, like when we're designing something for a screen. And so there's an aspect of typography that is totally grounded in the hundreds of years of history. And then there's an aspect of it that is completely unique to the way we have to address it, particularly, in the last 10, 15 years since the advent of mobile devices that, were really capable of showing things, since the iPhone and Android came along.
Yeah.
And so when people don't have any grounding in that, then they make choices based on different criteria. And so, in the advent of the sort of no disrespect to the creators of Bootstrap, but in the Bootstrap era of, this sort of component kind of design ideas, you see the centered text everywhere because it might be one column, it might be four, and of these little card elements. And to the designer's eye or the developer's eye, there's a symmetry that's being looked for there. So they just center everything. And I think there are just better ways to handle that. But if you don't, absent an understanding that it's harder for someone to read when their eye can't go back to a consistent place on the next line, that left justified or leading edge justified based on script, then it slows people down. And so it makes it harder for them to trust a website or to get the information they need to make a purchasing decision.
Yeah, sure. All right. So definitely it brings a big advantage to people then learning about these basics of typography. And what also comes quite interesting to me is that it feels to me that you're always on this intersection, as you mentioned, between design and development. So also bringing it into reality, not just thinking it up and polishing it in a design tool, but also how it can be applied in the real world, aka the browser then. And where we would arrive at variable fonts, which are the state of the art of web typography nowadays. And I assume most of my audience is familiar with variable fonts, but could you just in a nutshell, 1-2 sentence, explain what variable fonts are before we go more into the details there?
Sure. Well, for anyone that has worked with fonts, either installing them locally on your computer or setting them up for use on the web, you're probably familiar with the idea that every single weight and variant, regular, bold, italic, heavy, wide, narrow, whatever it is a single file.
Yeah.
And that's how it's been for a very, very long time, as long as there's been digital type. And generally speaking, there's a couple exceptions, but the idea of a variable font is to take the whole range of that design space and combine it in a single file, which then allows it to act like many. So I'm just kind of paraphrasing John Hudson's description. It's one font file that acts as many. And for the web, that means through CSS, we get to make it bolder or lighter, wider or narrower, upright or italic, whatever axes of variation the type designer has included. So that's another important thing to point out to people is there's nothing artificial about this. It's not the browser faking anything. It's whatever the weight range is that the typeface designer included, whatever other axes of variation they've included, those are the things that we can change. So it doesn't artificially alter the typeface. I guess that's the important thing too.
We're not going down the road to faux italic will or
exactly
or
right
into the hell of faux italic will and faux bold. And we know font stretch, one of the properties, isn't a proper name for it, but it does not stretch the font. It changes the width of the typeface. All right. Okay. So with that in mind, I read your article on the Web's Almanac in 2020, I think it was, and time flies. I think it did not change that much in 2021. But what they pointed out there, or you pointed out there, was the increase of the usage of variable fonts compared to 2019, where it was about 1.8%, I read, and now, back in 2020, we were up to 11% almost of variable fonts. Why do you think, is it only or is it a lot? What do you think about this? What do you think about the current state of adoption of variable fonts in real projects? Because we almost always saw these variable fonts, fancy, nice transitions, animations on conference sites, most of the time Type Foundry sites, of course, and other, let's say, artsy kind of sites, but not really in production use for a long time. So what do you think about this adoption right now?
We talk about this a lot in various circles and podcasts and articles. So what led to that massive jump from one year to the next? And I saw the data. Unfortunately, I was actually signed up to write the 2021 chapter for the Web Almanac, and we had a mix-up, unfortunately, with getting all of the queries run in order to actually write something based on that data. I know the value is a lot higher.
All right. Yeah.
So the reason that it jumped so much is because of Google. Google,
Okay.
a year or two earlier, started to experiment, and this is something that a lot of people miss about variable fonts, is that they are intended to work seamlessly with our existing CSS. So, for example, when you say bold as a font weight, that's a keyword for 700. It's an alias basically for a font weight of 700. So if you load a variable font and give it the same family name as what you would be using for, let's say, well, in this case, they were using Oswald. So that was the first one that they started doing this with. And Oswald normal maps to 400 for the weight axis. Oswald bold maps to 700. And if you just swap in the Oswald variable font and do nothing else, don't change anything in the CSS on the site itself, it's going to act exactly the same. And that's really a remarkable proof of the technology, that they were able to start serving this millions and millions and millions of times without the owners of those sites ever having to alter a line of their CSS.
That's pretty awesome, because they basically just changed the font face declaration and included, I guess, then the font weight, the range of whatever the typeface provided. Yeah.
And so, we have to acknowledge that a variable font, a single variable font file, is definitely going to be larger than a corresponding single weight file. But the engineers at Google are pretty brilliant when it comes to subsetting and compression and everything. So what they were finding is that they could start to serve the variable font in place of 2 or 3 other weights and actually have a bandwidth savings. So when you multiply that out over the millions of people who use variable fonts, it started to become pretty clear to them that they could have fewer assets to manage and use less bandwidth to serve these files. And with Google Fonts, there's a lot of caching across sites. So when you visit one site with Oswald, and then you go to another site that's using Oswald, if they're both being served from Google CDN, your browser is going to cache that file, and you're not going to load it on the next visit. So there's a ton of advantages to that. And so they invested really heavily in having typeface designers improve the fonts that they had and convert them to the top fonts that they were serving over to variable fonts. So over the course of the last year or two, they've done this to many of their top typefaces. And so that has enabled them to start serving more and more of it. Now, that addresses the technical side. And so the implementation and usage has grown tremendously. I think that we still are in a time when there are not enough Olivers and Jasons and Mandys in the world going out at all of these web design conferences to educate the designers about what they can get out of this. Now, Sketch supports variable fonts. I know it's in beta in some of the other web type tools, and it's in the Creative Suite tools from Adobe. It works. It's not perfect, but at least it's sort of there. That's part of what hurts its adoption on the design side. But we need more people to talk about the benefits stylistically, aesthetically, and that's so things like I use it. I've used variable fonts in a number of pretty large projects for a sports broadcasting platform in the US. It's part of the Bleacher Report. I helped them convert that over to variable fonts. That's millions and millions of views. And we saved a ton of downloads. We took over 300K of font weight out of what was being loaded every page by shifting everything to variable fonts. But it also in the web platforms for the state of Rhode Island and where I live, and also Georgia, another one in the US, we used variable fonts and reduced file weight, but also in Rhode Island enabled typography fine-tuned for dark mode.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
when you invert the contrast, wanting to reduce the font weight just a tiny bit, we
yeah,
can reduce it by 30 or 40 instead of a full step and load another
yeah,
asset because we
yeah,
were using variable fonts.
yeah.
And so that keeps the type really much clearer
Mm,
when you reverse that light text on a dark background. Um, and so those are some of the things as designers we can think about fine tuning the weight of what bold means. It
yeah,
doesn't have to be as chunky as a 700 weight if we don't need it to be. Um,
sure. Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense, and also is a perfect segue into another issue where, or another topic with user interfaces. I strongly focus on user interfaces right now because I want to encourage people using different typefaces than the familiar ones. Like everything's, they're not bad. Roboto is not bad. Inter is not bad. San Francisco is not bad. They're all okay. They are made to be okay. And I don't have anything against them, but it lacks personality.
mhm.
And I want to help people decide for another font for the user interfaces. And also, this is a big advantage, I think, when it comes to variable fonts. Roboto and Inter and all these typefaces are variable fonts, but when you pick a typeface for a user interface, what do you think? What are the advantages that could come except from fine-tuning it in dark mode and with the contrast? What other advantages could there be for user interface design? So for very small sizes, short text that
Mhm.
have to be highly legible.
So there's the first thing that comes to mind is actually something that I'm currently working through at Chewy, which is personality. So, the thing about Helvetica or San Francisco or Roboto or, and on and on and on, is they're designed to work everywhere. So they're intentionally designed in a fairly neutral way, meaning that they don't have any or a lot of sort of visible quirks or things that impart any kind of an emotional tone. They're very purposely designed to not do that, so that they can be used in any environment, and they, in a sense, will just sort of disappear. But at Chewy, uh, so for those outside the U.S. and who don't own pets, Chewy is a company that sells a massive amount, I mean, billions and billions of dollars of pet foods, medications, toys,
Okay.
costumes, you name it,
Costumes
for
is
all
great.
kinds of. The Halloween shop is pretty entertaining, for dogs, cats, and many other kinds of pets, and they have all kinds of health services for veterinary practices, and it's one of the largest pet pharmacies in the world. So, like, there's all kinds of interesting things going on. They're famous for their customer support and the warmth
Okay.
and friendliness that you experience if you ever need to contact them. And if you look across the landscape right now, primarily you see on Chewy apps and websites a mix of Roboto, San Francisco, shifting towards Poppins and Work Sans, but none
Okay.
of those are our
Whoa.
brand.
Yeah.
I know it's like the list of like the most popular, uh, any tech company kind of typefaces, and this is they were chosen for reasonable reasons.
Sure.
But our brand typeface is Gordita by Type Atelier in Brisbane, Australia, and it's a really nice, much warmer sans, sort of a humanist geometric kind of
Yeah.
blend, and it really has that warmth and character that is much closer to our brand identity. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on right now is getting the licensing in place and getting the cooperation so that we can start to work that into our design system, and eventually work that through website, apps, and everything else. It's very much a work in progress, but so this personality, that's a
Yeah.
big thing.
Yeah.
um where uh where variable fonts, I think, can really add to our efforts in interface design is also with an axis that we haven't talked about yet called optical size. Optical size is an axis, it's an idea that actually goes back hundreds of years. I have a graphic of an example of a type specimen from the 1700s from William Caslin, showing the differences in how the letter forms were cut at 6-point size versus 72-point size. And you see the smaller one has less contrast in the strokes, so it's a little sturdier. So meaning it's going to be more legible at smaller sizes. And then at larger sizes, you can get a little bit more contrast, a little more thick and thin, a little more fine detail, because the letter forms are large enough to really see it. And that is in essence, that is optical size. And that is actually one of the 5 standard axes sort of set out in the variable font format when it was introduced. And there are a bunch of typefaces that do support it. Actually, Roslindale on my website is a good example of that. When you look at the headings on my site, it's rwt.io if anyone's curious. The headings, you see a real exaggerated thick and thin. It's a beautiful typeface when it's set large for display purposes, but it is exactly the same file that is displaying the text as well. So when you look at the body copy, it looks much more like what you'd see in a newspaper, for example, with much less contrast, and it's a little bit sturdier and easier to read at small sizes. So it's more subtle in sans serif typefaces, but it can be really effective. I've seen some people tie not just the stroke contrast in letter forms to size, but also things like apertures, the openings in the letters, or the terminals, like where the ends of those strokes, all getting more open at a smaller size. So it helps maintain that legibility. And I think those are some of the key areas where variable font could really add to the legibility and utility of a typeface for interface use.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a great point. One that comes into my mind is Case. I think it's by Eric Spiekermann as well, but and another designer. Sorry for not coming up with the name, but Spiekermann I remembered, of course, from Fontwerk, where they also have an optical sizing axis, and they even changed the shapes, as you said, from the apertures and also from the terminals. Like the lowercase l gets a serif in the smallest size. So you can distinguish it more easily from an uppercase I, for example, if it's a sans serif. So this is very beneficial, and as well, when it comes to spacing, of course, everything is a bit more spaced out. You don't have to increase the letter spacing manually, what you should in most typefaces, because they're made for most, or depending on typeface, when they are made for body text sizes, where you have to increase them then when they're smaller sizes. Yeah, this is a great advantage. Also, I love this one about personality, because this is also so near and dear to my heart, to make the world of typography a bit more diverse, more interesting. And this is the one quote that I stole from you, or I quote you actually on it. This type is never neutral. I love this. I just love this. The example with the I love you note you gave at the one talk in, I think it was the what was it? Maybe in Event Apart or something like this, where I saw it, a recording of that. And it's so clear. It's absolutely right. It's never neutral. Of course it's not, because even if they say, I talked to Jose Scarione from Type Together last week, and he also says, people think neutrality is a good thing or something to achieve. Even though it's not neutral, it always communicates something. That's the thing. And also very interesting that you found a place to work that also might be more exciting for your dogs, Tristan and Tilly, compared to the stuff you did before. Whatever you're doing now, but I think you're getting something chewy for them.
Yes, very true. I can't really think of a more on-brand place for me to be than working for doing font-related design system work for a company that caters to Tilly right there. There she is. I can get a better look.
I saw her. Yeah, absolutely. It's like a dream coming true, I guess.
I have to say it really, and I've thought about this an awful lot. It is for many reasons. I mean, all jokes aside, um, my job as a principal designer um, as much as it is around sort of shaping the future of our design system and what we think we want it to be, this year, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. But it's, spending time working with the engineering teams about how we implement stuff and working with our CMS team around what is the vision that we have for how we author content, because authoring content and modeling it is intimately tied to how you display it. And so, spending time with that team, working with the branding team around how we can bring that personality and voice into our digital presence as much, as well as they have it integrated in our advertising and marketing. So I get to kind of work with everybody. I love it.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really, it just make every day, like as soon as I'm done with this, I'm going back into a design sprint that I've been running with the CMS team on our technology platform. And, so it's different stuff every day. And I've been having a great time. I've only been here for 4 months, but
yeah,
it's just an amazing team of people to
yeah.
work with.
Yeah, sounds great. Sounds very exciting. Yeah, coming back to variable fonts though,
Mhm.
what do you think when you, besides the fact that people are not familiar with the superpowers, and as you described optical sizing, one of the things that I'm super excited about as well, using it as well on my side with Piazzolla that has an optical sizing axis. What do you think are some obstacles people still face when it comes to implementing or wrapping their heads around variable
Yeah.
fonts?
Well, I think it is just what you described, wrapping your heads around the possibility. Because the implementation is getting easier. Browsers have been pretty thorough in their implementation of it. I mean, there's still a couple of quirks here and there, but generally speaking, you can everything works pretty easily, and works very reliably from one place to the next. I mean, when I've seen any issues, sometimes people will reach out, and I'm always happy that they do and say, "Hey, we're trying to work with variable fonts, and this thing is happening." And usually, I know what it is as soon as they describe the problem. Like, well, check your font face declaration or check whatever. Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with the font. I'm sure of that. It's just let's take a look at the CSS and see what you're doing, and wanting to make sure that that piece is handled. Then it's really about designers thinking more creatively with what they have. Designing with a single typeface, that's been a challenge that people have faced for a very long time. What we have with a variable font is way more than just working with different weights of it. I mean, so one of the earliest ones that I got a chance to work with from CJ Dunbar was Dunbar,
Yeah.
which has a variable axis for the ascenders and descenders, and an X height, and so you can make it look really modern or really Art Deco. There's all these different ways that you can work with it that really alters the personality of the type while you're working with it, and teaching designers to think about all of those ways to vary stuff in their interface animations, in headings and display sizes and captions, and really leaning hard into. There was one Pangea from Christoph Koberlin was one that had an axis
Yeah.
to change the terminals and the apertures,
Yeah.
and stuff that Underwear does to basically give you an axis of time that would almost like let things draw in. They're fascinating, and I think we're really at the very beginning of what can be done. I think motion is a place where they'll really excel. Studio Dunbar and others did this incredible. Basically, it's like an animated poster festival in the train station in Rotterdam a few years ago. And so imagine all these digital displays with all these like typographic posters that were all animated variable fonts. So it's not even a web page. It's actually using it in motion graphics and motion design.
Yeah.
That was just it's incredible what we could do to draw people's eye and help you read a message
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
emphasizing things over time.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great addition. Yeah, sure. When it comes to file size, though, I'm currently in the situation of, yeah, I didn't dig a lot into this issue, and I know there's Zach Leatherman who's a genius about this as well. Maybe I should invite him as well and draw
You
the
should.
news.
He's great.
Yeah, and I even met him in person at Beyond Terra some years ago, and this was also great to chat with him. But right now, when I'm loading Piazzolla, the variable font, and it has around 250 kilobytes, even at WAV2. So the character set is pretty extended. That's the one thing. So I should remove some character support, I guess, that I'm not using on my blogs to make it a bit smaller. And the other problem is I have some text set in italic, and I can't go back to the static italic because of the optical sizing, because it looks very off when it's in there.
Yeah.
So I have another 250 kilobytes only for the italics. So that's a bit cumbersome. My readers will have to download that. I can live with it. If they can download 1 megabyte of an image or a YouTube video about me, they might also download some font files.
Right.
But of course, I want to make it as slick and small as possible. Do you have any tips on that?
I do. There's a few. Where it's allowable, using a subsetting tool of some kind, whether it's Glyphhanger or font tools or something like that. And again, it's just stressing if the license allows. So you have to remember, it's a commercial. If it's a commercial typeface, if you don't have express permission from the foundry where you got it, you're altering a piece of software. So that's violating the license. If you have permission, then subset can often cut the file size in half or more by removing the glyphs that you're not using. So, my site is in English language, so a Latin 1 extended character set is more than I need. So that usually eliminates several hundred characters from many different typefaces that I'm just not going to end up needing. And that will help reduce the file size. I also, I use Roel Niskin's site, What Can My Font Do? Or What Can My Font Do?
Yeah, I love his site,
using his tool to figure out what are all the open type features there, and am I going to use them all? So if you don't have any reason to include small caps, when you're subsetting, if you remove that or omit that, you're removing another chunk of characters that you don't need. If you aren't doing a lot of superscripts and subscripts, then you can remove those. So there's a lot of fine tuning that you can do that will help reduce the file size and get it smaller and smaller. And then that will lower the amount of font data. But then as long as you are loading it with font display swap in your settings, using a font manager and styling the fallback fonts, then you're not going to negatively impact your core web vitals. So your site will still load quickly, and you'll still be able to get all your content on screen. You'll have less layout shift because there'll be less reflow going on. So you can address all of those negative concerns around loading that font asynchronously, so that the page draws and then it redraws once it gets the web font. And then you need to accept that 100K, 200K, 300K, whatever it is of font data is cached. It's never going to get loaded again.
That's good, yeah.
So it is. And so if you don't have any italics on the first page that they look at, then they're not loading the italic font then either. They're going to load that once they hit a page that actually has italics on it. And so you can stagger the load of those things as well. And with that combination of things, using the font loading management, making sure you're caching the fonts properly, then you don't really have that big an issue. And the likelihood is on any site of any size, you're probably loading way more JavaScript than you are loading font
Using.
data, and you're only loading that once.
That's good.
So
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's same thing, optimizing images and all that. Like, yes, all of this stuff is really important, but the mileage that you get out of loading a font resource informs and impacts the display of every word on every page. So
Oh,
I,
that's
I
good.
think
Yeah.
the value that you get out of that download, I think is what's key to focus on. But to get past engineering, you've got to be able to prove that you're not going to negatively impact web performance. So that's where you've got to load it properly. I'm a big fan of Font Face Observer from Bromstein. That's the
Mm-hmm.
one that I use the most. I've written about that and explained that in my newsletter as well. So that's worth pointing people to resources like that, because that makes a massive difference in how addressing any of the negative concerns that an engineering team might put up to say, don't load this font data. No, we're
Yeah.
going to load it. We're just going to load it right so
Yeah.
that it doesn't negatively impact performance or user experience. And
Yeah.
then we get to improve the design.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, especially the part where it has a lot of value for the overall experience of the site. You're downloading this only once, and if you do it right, it's improved for the whole experience on this site and not just for this one page load. So this is very well put.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
One more thing.
Yeah, sure.
Because this problem is going to entirely go away with what we've been working on in the Web Font Working Group at the W3C.
Yeah.
And that has recently been published as the first public working draft of progressive font downloading. And
Okay.
that is something that is going to completely sidestep the issue, because it is an evolution in font serving and format that will allow the font to be downloaded dynamically subset by the browser and server together to only serve the characters that are needed to render the page that you're viewing. And then when you go to the next page, serve the next chunk of characters that you need to complete to view that page, and so on until eventually you might download the whole font. You might never download the whole font.
Oh,
But
that's
instead
awesome.
of being that 250K, it might be 57K to only serve the glyphs that you need for that page. So the size of the font file will not matter. So our stuff is peanuts when you compare it to 2.5 megs for an Arabic font or 15 megs for a Japanese or a Chinese or Korean font. That's normal, and that's why you don't see web fonts used nearly as much without a commercial solution. Typekit and Monotype and others have long had a way to dynamically subset CJK fonts or Arabic fonts dynamically, so that they can be used in a performant way. We've been working on a way to generalize that. And so the spec has been written. There are proofs of concept that have been created. There's representation from WebKit, Firefox, Chrome, Edge. All the major browser vendors are part of that working group, and we've got participation from major foundries like Monotype as well. So we'll see that within the next year or two. I think is pretty safe to say that we'll actually start to see that working its way out into the world. But that is going to be, that's the final, kick the tent pole out of, from under the objections for using web fonts. They'll are going to completely go away once that's available.
This is so awesome. Would this require a different font format then?
So I think that there are a couple of ways that it can be done. Generally, I think there is going to be I've missed a couple of the most recent calls, so I'm not sure where we landed on all of this, but I think that there's going to be a change in how the font format is set up, but it's a minor one, it's still going to be WAF 2. It's
All
just
right.
going to be an iteration of that. And then there's also basically like a server side plugin. So like a module for Apache or Nginx or something like that, that will handle the server side piece of this.
Okay, awesome. So thanks a lot, Jason. Wrapping up with my final fast round of questions. 3 fast questions. A quick intuitive answer to you. Free fonts or paid fonts?
The right font. How's that? I think
Awesome.
there are. So you mentioned Jose. I did a bunch of work with Jose and Veronica from Type Together, creating demos for Literata and a few of their other variable fonts. And Literata is gorgeous. It's beautiful. That happens to be open source. But Proxima Vera is incredible from Mark Simonson. That's the variable version of Proxima Nova. I'd pay for that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. M dash or N dash?
Well, I love a good M dash, and I like the way that looks typographically. But if you've got a date range, you're supposed to use an N dash. So it depends on usage.
Definitely, and also on the circumstances in German typography and Austrian, and also in British, as I saw you use, instead of the M dash, you use an N dash with some spaces before and after.
That's the nuanced stuff that I love about going to international type conferences. That's because I only know what looks like good typography to me from in my English language US centric worldview.
Sure.
I've got some books that I bought on Japanese and Chinese typography, and I'm always fascinated to learn more about what does good typography mean in other settings. And that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure, it's always what you're used to basically then. And finally, Comic Sans or Papyrus?
I think I can find more acceptable circumstances to see Comic Sans than I can think of acceptable uses for Papyrus. How's that?
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Jason. So where can people go to find out more about you and the stuff you're doing?
So if you want to catch up on anything that I've written about web typography, if you go to rwt.io, that's where all of that stuff is collected. Under tips is all of the newsletter archives, and a bunch of my talks and videos and stuff are there. And if you want to see more pictures of Tilly, if you follow me on Instagram at jpamental, Jpamental, same thing on pretty much all the social media, but Instagram is the best place for dog pics. So that's, well, we can leave it at that. Or Strava if you're a cyclist. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks a lot for joining. I had a great time. Hope you as well. And see you in the next.
I did. Cheers, Oliver. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
What a brilliant answer to my Comic Sans question, wasn't it? I just like it. Again, it took me quite some time to actually edit this, record this, do all the stuff. So I tend to put a lot of things on my plate, but I'm happy it's finally out. I'm very curious what you think about it. So I really appreciate your feedback, your suggestions for topics or guests. And you can send it to oliver@pimpmytype.com or via the comments on YouTube or in the blog on pimpmytype.com/talk03. Remember to subscribe to the newsletter for your weekly Font Friday update, and see you in the next one.